Tiny Tina's Wonderlands is a game that I've personally been looking forward to since it was first revealed. The thought of a Borderlands game that exists in the mind of Tiny Tina herself sounded like a great idea to me. I'm very pleased to report that the game, at least in my eyes, has easily lived up to its expectations. It's a shorter but much more focused experience which discards the bloat and provides the player with a much clearer path to the endgame. It does definitely have some issues with bugs, glitches, and its overall polish, but if you were to roll a d10, I suspect the result would be a critical success. Tiny Tina's Wonderlands, not to be confused with Tiny Tina's Assault on Dragon Keep, is a brand new Borderlands spin-off adventure. It blends together the much-loved first-person looter-shooter Borderlands experience with a medieval theme. It's set in a Dungeons & Dragons-inspired tabletop role-playing game called Bunkers and Badasses with none other than Tiny Tina herself as the GM. You inhabit the body of a new player to Tina's tabletop game who fights alongside the veteran players, Valentine and Fret, in order to stop the Dragon Lord from taking over the Wonderlands. The game features a great cast of voices for its new characters and of course for the returning ones as well. Captain Valentine is voiced by Andy Samberg, Fret is voiced by Wanda Sykes, and the Dragon Lord is brought to life by Will Arnett. Tiny Tina is once again voiced by Ashley Birch, who surprisingly also lends her voice to Aloy from the Horizon games. The story of the game has two layers to it, the quote real-life section and then the fictional tabletop role-playing section. In the real-life section, Valentine has accidentally crashed the ship into a mountain, and so you're all basically stuck there playing Bunkers and Badasses to pass the time while you wait for a rescue. In the actual tabletop game section though, you play as a Fate Maker, a name given to heroes who are trying to take down the Dragon Lord in Tina's new campaign. New to the series is the ability to create your player character as opposed to choosing an existing named character from a selection. The game gives you a lot of options to fully customize your character, and you can unlock many more options simply by playing through the game. You can change your hair, face shape, height, armor patterns, armor materials, and so much more, although it's worth noting that the armor's actual appearance is dependent on what you have equipped. After you've finalized your look, you'll be asked to select your class from the 6 available at launch. You've got the Stabomancer, who focuses on critical and melee damage, the Clawbringer, who has a Wyvern companion and can spec into fire or lightning damage, the Spellshot, who has increased spell damage, can turn enemies into harmless skeep, which essentially are skags covered in wool, and wield 2 spells at the same time. Then you've got the Graveborn, who has a Demi-Lich companion and can sacrifice health for increased damage output, the Spore Warden, who gets a little mushroom companion and can fire a barrage of arrows or create frost cyclones. And finally we have the Berserker, who specializes in dealing frost damage with a great hammer by either spinning around with it or diving towards the targeted enemy and slamming the ground. Later on in the game, you'll unlock the ability to equip a second class, allowing you to mix and match them in a variety of combinations. I myself, on my first playthrough, chose to be a Clawbringer and then later spec'd into Spore Warden, meaning that I had 2 companions up at all times, which was very helpful during solo play. Once you've settled on your starting class, you can select your character's background and add hero points to your stats. The character's background adds an upper cap to certain stats while lowering the caps of others. These stats are strength, dexterity, intelligence, wisdom, constitution, and attunement. These govern crit damage, crit chance, spell cooldown, status damage, max HP/ward, and skill cooldown respectively. The game does actually tell you which stats you should be investing in for the class that you've chosen, but you can essentially put the points wherever you'd like. If you're familiar with the Borderlands games, then you should be very familiar with this game's core mechanics. I wouldn't say the entire game is a carbon copy with a fresh skin over it, but some of it definitely is. For those of you who might be completely new to the series, the game is a looter shooter, which means that you'll be doing a lot of first-person shooting and a lot of gear looting. Plus, obviously some light RPG elements like leveling up to get stronger, acquiring skill points for your skill tree, and building up your character in a way that suits your playstyle. As you might expect, the game features a main questline, but there's also a ton of side quests, collectibles, and secrets to find as well. Another new addition to the Borderlands formula is the overworld. This is basically meant to function like a tabletop game board, and you'll be using it to travel around the world in order to get to where the quests are. Once you reach the quest location on the game board, you'll be loaded into the area and the traditional Borderlands gameplay will resume. The overworld isn't just for traveling though. It's also got collectibles to find, side quests to uncover, shortcuts to open, shrine pieces to obtain, and encounters to, well, encounter I guess. The shrines dotted around the map grant various passive bonuses like extra money, increased XP, or better loot luck when completed. In order to complete and activate a shrine, you must collect all 4 shrine pieces for each one. The pieces are usually hidden on the overworld map somewhere or found in a specific dungeon encounter. If you walk up to the entrance of a specific dungeon in the overworld and it contains a shrine piece, Tina will actually tell you about it and mark it on your map for you. When you found the 4 pieces, you can return to the shrine itself and activate it to enjoy the benefits. You'll also find some campsite encounters in the overworld which can be completed for extra loot, and you can walk around in the tall grass to trigger a basic encounter. When triggered, an enemy will show up and attempt to walk into you to actually start the fight. If you don't want to fight the enemy that shows up, simply just smack them and they'll go away. As I mentioned earlier, a huge part of Wonderlands and the entire Borderlands series is its randomized loot drops. The game uses a typical color-coded system to convey rarity and an item score to further indicate its power. There is no overall gear score though, like you would find in Destiny 2 or The Division, but you're generally looking to equip the highest rarity and the highest item score possible. Very few of the weapons look, act or feel like regular guns. You can definitely find some traditional Borderlands style guns from time to time, but the majority of them have been given a fantasy twist, like a machine gun that fires crossbow bolts in an arc, or a shotgun that shoots waves of energy and gets reloaded by sprinkling magic powder over the crystals in its chamber. In previous Borderlands games, you had 4 weapon slots, a grenade mod, a class mod, a shield mod, and an artifact. This has changed somewhat in Wonderlands. You now have 4 weapon slots, a melee weapon, an amulet, a spell, armor, and 2 ring slots. You now have the ability to choose your melee weapon, which have their own stats, bonuses, and some of them even feel a little bit different to swing. Amulets and rings provide simple boosts and bonuses, but arguably the biggest change is actually the spell slot. In a way, it's kinda like this game's version of the grenade mod, but they're just so varied and different that it always feels like something completely new. You have spells that bring meteors down from the sky, some that cause ice spikes to rise from the ground, some that allow you to spew flames from your hands or throw a gelatinous cube that coats the floor with poison, and so much more. At this point in time, I've just about completed 2 full playthroughs and I'm still finding new spells that I hadn't seen before. Lastly, once you've completed the main quest, you'll gain access to a few things, the most important of which is the Chaos Chamber, which is basically your main endgame activity. It's a set of randomized encounters where you can sort of choose your own adventure and even go after targeted rewards. As you fight through the encounters, killing enemies, gaining XP, and collecting loot, you'll also be gathering small crystals. You can spend these small crystals during the encounters themselves on things like extra gun damage to make the encounter easier, or you can save them up for the end of the run, where you can spend them on randomized loot drops for specific types. If you want a new amulet, or you want a new spell, or perhaps a brand new sniper rifle, you can get those drops that you want. The max player level in the base game is 40, and at that level you'll also unlock mythic ranks. These are levels that you gain after 40, but you achieve them much more quickly than a standard level. Every time you level up your mythic rank, you'll gain a point to spend on various extra passive bonuses like an increase to fire damage or something like improved loot luck. So, what are my personal opinions on Tiny Tina's Wonderlands? Well, honestly, I really loved it. I thought it looked great, played great, and the writing feels much more like Borderlands 2 than Borderlands 3, which is absolutely a bonus in my book. Sadly, it does definitely have far more bugs and glitches than I think's acceptable, but we'll get into those in a minute. Before we really get into it, I wanted to talk about the 2 graphical modes that the game gives you. These actually caught me off guard on my first playthrough, and it could have been easily avoided. So, in most console games that I've played, performance mode usually targets 60 FPS at a reduced resolution, while the resolution mode generally aims for something like 1440p or 4K at 30 FPS. I myself selected performance mode, but I did notice that parts of the gameplay and the UI looked a bit blurry. I ended up playing through my entire first run of the game in this mode, and while it did look good, it definitely seemed a bit blurry in the game world and especially in the menus. I just thought, well, if this is what has to happen to get the game to run at 60 FPS, then so be it, I suppose. It turns out that performance mode is actually for 120 FPS, which my TV does not support, and the resolution mode runs at, I believe, 4K dynamic resolution and targets 60 FPS. So I switched to resolution mode for my second playthrough, and yeah, it looks a ton better and runs at 60 FPS very consistently, at least for me. I did see a ton of people saying that resolution mode is not 60 FPS, but honestly it absolutely is. I've also seen a lot of people who own a PS5 or a Series X buying the standard version of the game when you actually need the next level edition of Wonderlands in order to get the full next-gen support. Essentially, people have been buying the standard PS4 edition digitally on their PS5 and wondering why it's not working properly. So once again, you have to buy the next level edition to get the performance upgrades on the current gen consoles. If I'm not mistaken, the next level edition of the game does actually cost more money, but I don't think it should. I think it should cost the same as it does on PS4 as it does on PS5, but just simply run better on the console with more advanced hardware. I shouldn't be surprised though, I guess. I mean, this is the modern gaming industry after all. To be honest, I don't really know what to believe. Some people say that they have the PS5 version and both modes run like crap, and I personally haven't had that experience at all. I've had a few issues, with their shift server thing disconnecting and reconnecting all the time, and also some awful stuttering in places, but in all fairness, it was very rare. What bothers me the most about it though is that when you select these settings in the game's options menu, they don't actually tell you what they do. If it actually said, if it actually told me that performance mode targets 120 FPS and resolution mode targets 60 FPS, I would have just picked resolution from the start, but nope, let's just keep it as vague as possible, I guess. But anyway, enough of that stuff, let's talk about the actual game itself. As a general rule, I like pretty much all of it. I've always liked Borderlands as a series, so I was pretty much bound to enjoy this. I mean, I've played through Borderlands 1, 2, and 3, plus all DLC multiple times, and the same goes for the pre-sequel and the slight remaster of the first game. I've also read a lot of the comics and played Tales from the Borderlands as well. I'm also interested in picking up that new miniatures board game that's going to be released this year. That looks pretty fun as well. So yeah, needless to say, I am a bit of a fan. Funnily enough, one of the main things I liked about Wonderlands specifically was that it's a much shorter and more focused game than the other ones. You can beat the story and get to max level in probably under half the time of the mainline games, and that really helped me get into it. Don't get me wrong, I love the mainline games, I really do, but there's always some sections that drag on and take forever to get through, which means that I don't exactly want to beat the game with all the available classes. It's a huge time sink usually, and as I said, it tends to drag on, but here, because you can get through it at a brisk pace, it lends itself better to replayability, and I appreciate that about it. I think some scenes and dialogues still do outstay their welcome in Wonderlands from time to time, where you're standing around waiting for the character to just shut up so you can actually move on, but still, overall, I think I prefer it this way. It was also a great idea to give Tina her own full game because, pretty much anything can happen at any moment. While some of it does follow the old Dungeons & Dragons tropes for comedic purposes, the rest is just whatever Tina decides to throw at you. That said, I was hoping for a bit more tabletop RPG flavor here and there. There are some quests where you can sort of choose to complete it in a different way, but it generally doesn't really matter to the story. I think it would have been a really fun idea to actually roll some in-game dice to determine story beats. So maybe you could get a completely different mainline quest depending on your roll of the dice and or the choices you've already made previously. Sort of like a branching path, I suppose. As an example, once you've done the tutorial and you're about to do your first mission, maybe you could roll some dice and determine the next story mission, which could have the same end result, but play out very differently in a different location. I mean, I'm just throwing ideas out here, maybe that wouldn't work, but you get my point. The new spell items are pretty cool as well, they just have so much variety even within the same types. There's one that I got early on that brings down sort of like an ice meteor which explodes and deals frost damage on impact. Then later on I got a spell that calls down a much larger fire meteor that has a massive AoE explosion that deals heavy fire damage. After that I was playing a little bit of co-op and I noticed that my friend had a spell that called down loads of smaller dark magic meteors in a much wider area, and I'm sure there's even more variations that I've not seen yet. I wouldn't even want to guess how many different spells there are, but it is a great system either way. They pretty much all feel great to use and they're really easy to weave into your standard combat. A lot of them even let you fire your gun while casting, which is a nice touch. The only spells I didn't really like is some of the cast on yourself ones. There's a few that put up a sort of bubble shield around you which stop projectiles and deal damage to enemies that enter into it. Those are pretty cool, but then you have a few that basically produce a small shockwave around you when you cast it, and I've always found them a bit too dangerous to actually use up close. I'm not going to spoil anything here obviously, but I really did enjoy the story and the way it ties itself back into the mainline series. Plus learning the reasons why the Bunkers and Badasses game is so special to Tina was nice to see. The new characters were mostly awesome, and for me Andy Samberg and Wanda Sykes were great as Valentine and Fret, but I think they were just slightly outshined by Will Arnett as the Dragon Lord. I found him, and honestly all of them, to be genuinely funny, which is quite refreshing after what we got in Borderlands 3. I don't think the Dragon Lord is quite as good as Handsome Jack, but I mean, I don't think we're ever going to get a villain quite as good as him ever again. I think there's only a few characters in the game that I didn't find funny or interesting. I think the game tried way too hard to make some of them relevant and ended up making them feel really cringy instead, but there's way more hits than misses and it's all subjective anyway. The only things that I could really point to as being actively bad were the bugs, glitches, and the overall polish, or the lack thereof. The game has more visual bugs and problems than I could count, and that's not even an exaggeration. I would estimate probably hundreds of instances across my 2 playthroughs, and while none of them broke the game, they still shouldn't be there. And there's 2 sides to this. On the one hand, at the end of the game they do let you know that Wonderlands was made almost entirely during the lockdowns with everyone working from home, and yeah, that must have brought some delays and some problems, I don't doubt that at all. And it does explain why the game doesn't have the same level of polish that they usually do. They probably just didn't have the ability to fine-tune and check every little thing like they usually would, and I do understand that. On the other hand though, why not delay the game for a month or 2 and perform those quality checks? Well, I would assume that the reason they didn't do that is because the game was releasing at the end of March, and they needed the game to be out and selling before the end of the business year, which is April 1st. I guess the investors needed to see their returns before the business year was up, and so it released as late as it could, and instead of delaying it into the next year, which would have probably negatively affected some of the performance-related bonuses and future investments, it released without the usual quality assurance. Now perhaps I'm wrong, but that certainly does seem at least plausible to me. The bugs and glitches themselves ranged from guns not actually firing any projectiles, item images being wrong or having an ugly black box around the image when it wasn't supposed to, the quest log vanishing for a short time, my character being unresponsive on the overworld and needing a restart of the game, cutscenes playing with me stuck in one place and being able to hear it but not actually be able to see it, the shift servers constantly disconnecting and reconnecting, and finally the occasional stuttering and momentary freezes of about 1 to 3 seconds. Now imagine this will all be fixed in a patch very soon, but it really shouldn't have happened, and it isn't really acceptable in my opinion. It didn't ruin the game for me, but that's only because the worst of it was quite rare. Okay, the images showing up wrong or with a weird black box around them is a bit odd, but it's not game breaking. The stuttering, however, made the game absolutely unplayable for maybe a minute at a time, but it does go away and rarely comes back. If that kind of thing really bothers you, it's probably best to wait on the game until the patches roll out. In my opinion, Tiny Tina's Wonderlands is a colourful, entertaining and moorish first-person looter shooter that's hard to put down. It's pretty much a must-buy if you're already a Borderlands fan, although if you've never played a Borderlands game before, you might need to tread carefully as its style, humour, structure and story aren't going to be to everyone's tastes. That said, if you've got an open mind, you like the art style and you're into RPGs already, then I think I can safely recommend this to you. Ultimately, I think it's a great game that was shipped a few months too early and sadly let down by a lack of quality control. Nothing really broke the game for me personally, but it did bother and annoy me from time to time. If you're thinking about a purchase but you're still on the fence, I would just say wait until a patch or 2 has been released and then pick it up after that. At the end of the day, despite all of the problems, I enjoyed it so much that I'm actually going to paraphrase another respected YouTuber's review. He said that at this moment in time, I would absolutely want a Wonderlands 2 instead of a Borderlands 4. And personally, I couldn't agree more. If you enjoyed the video, I really hope you'll consider subscribing, and if you like what I do and want to help support the channel, please check out the first link in the video description down below. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.